As soon as I sit down, these are going to pop off. Okay? You guys ready? Okay, so you're going to do the slides from the back? Going to move them up? Okay, today we're going to finish talking about the intertestamental period a little more deeply. We're going to talk about history, politics, and culture in the years before Jesus. So for 300 to 400 years during the intertestamental period. So the next slide, or do I need the... There we go, thank you. This is a timeline. You won't be able to see it real well, but it's just mostly a reminder. Last week we talked about the books after Daniel. And I don't know if you remember my acronym. I've changed it slightly. It's for the books that came after Daniel. Haggai and Zechariah, then Esther, at least that's my opinion. There's other opinions. Then Ezra and Nehemiah, and then Malachi. So there are 6 books after Daniel. So the acronym, I've changed it to Hogzilla, HZ, Eats, Esther, Every, Ezra, Nut, N, Nehemiah, and Malachi, Mound. So Hogzilla eats every nut mound. That's the way I remember it anyway. So those are all the books that came in this time after Daniel right here. There's Haggai, Zechariah. They don't have Esther on here. I don't know where they put Esther. Oh yeah, here she is. Ezra, Nehemiah, and Malachi. So that's the order. So those are all in the 100 years after Daniel was over. And Malachi was the last book of the Old Testament. And then there were 400 years of silence, is what they call it. That does not mean God was not doing anything. It just means God was not talking to anybody in inspiration. It does not mean God didn't say anything to anybody. All it means is God didn't make any new Bible books. I think God did talk to some people. I think he spoke to Alexander the Great in a dream. He spoke to the high priest of Jerusalem in a dream. So God was working, but he was not making any new books, and he was not doing a lot of huge, obvious miracles. And the reasons, we discussed some of the possible reasons for that. It's probably because in these 400 years, while the people had nothing much to hear from God, then when Jesus and John the Baptist appear, suddenly there's miracles and God's talking, and then you've got Bible books galore in the early church. So what's happening is, remember the prophet Joel prophesied, in those days your men servants will dream dreams and your maidservants will, if you remember that passage, it's quoted often in the New Testament. So Joel's prophecy, which was way long before Daniel, was that all these miracles would come at the time of the Messiah. So it was a way to show that the Messiah is really coming now, after all this silence. And if you remember, there were 2 people who witnessed Jesus when he was a baby. One of them was, the woman was Anna. What was the name of the man? Zechariah. No wonder I'm confused. It's the same as his name. But it said they were waiting. They were told by the Holy Spirit that they would not see death until they saw the Lord's Messiah. So those 2 people stood in the temple when Jesus came in to be circumcised, 7th or 10th day of his birth. And so they were there and they testified that this is the Messiah. And of course, it doesn't seem that anyone believed them. But people should have believed with all of God's works going on when Jesus came. That would be over here. All the silence is over. But rather than accepting it, they rejected him. So we'll talk about that. So the next slide. Oh, I should have had this one up before. So God did not inspire any Bible books in those 400 years. That's one reason we reject the Apocrypha, because it appears that the apocryphal books, all but a few, were written during those years. There were no prophets speaking for God directly, but he was working mightily, fulfilling his plans. He saved his people many times, including from Alexander the Great, and etc. To increase the longing of the parched people for God's return, to make the coming of Christ more obvious, to discipline people, the Jews, for their continued faithlessness. They rebelled and ignored God quite a lot. However, they didn't do it they didn't do it in idolatrous manners like they used to. In the Old Testament, in the time of Moses and in the time of Elijah, when the people became faithless, they went after other gods. The difference, and it's an interesting question as to which is worse. The difference is that the people, as they became faithless, became legalistic. They continued to serve God, sort of. They served God with their deeds and their money, but they hated God in their hearts. Or, well, maybe hated God's a strong word. They ignored God in their hearts. So that's where we get Pharisees and Sadducees. We'll be talking about them. It gave the Jews time to see that they were evil, even when they were free and self-ruling. For about 100 years, I'll show you here, the time of the Maccabees, God allowed the Jewish people to be free of their oppressors. The Jews always thought, just like we probably would think, that if only we had different circumstances, if only we could have our own free country, we'd make a great country. And they didn't. The greatness of their country lasted about 20 or 30 years. Then it went into decline quickly. God was silent to the captive Jews in Egypt for hundreds of years. This is just to show this is not the only time God was silent. The 400 years was not the only time. Before Moses came, the Jews were in slavery for hundreds of years in Egypt, and God didn't speak to them. Partly punishment, partly preparing them for the coming of something better. And God has been silent since the New Testament was complete. Okay, so you see, after the New Testament books were all done, God has been silent ever since. But he's only been silent in the sense of not giving new books, no prophet speaking directly from God. It doesn't mean he's not still working, and it doesn't mean the Holy Spirit isn't working in us. But he's not doing any more of the old-style prophecies. Okay, next slide. Oh yes, this is what told us what was coming in the intertestamental period. Even though God did not give any new information from Malachi to the Gospels, Daniel told us, or I should say, the angel and or Jesus, Gabriel and Jesus told Daniel what would happen. In multiple visions, he had two visions, Nebuchadnezzar's statue vision and the four-beast vision of Daniel. And we were told both times what would happen. The angel said, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome, and then the eternal kingdom. This is another reason why we don't buy, at least I don't buy, and probably you don't buy, the dispensational idea that Rome has continued for thousands of years and that we're now in a fragmented Roman Empire. That's the way they have to do it in order to say we're still waiting for Jesus. No, most of Presbyterians in general would say the eternal kingdom of Jesus Christ started when he was resurrected and ascended into heaven. So the kingdom is here. We're not waiting for it. Dispensationalists are still waiting for it. So, next slide. Okay, so this is a review. This is the probable timeline of the post-exilic prophets, which just means after Daniel. Okay, so here's Daniel in captivity 70 years. Here's Haggai and Zechariah. They are prophesying in their books about you need to hurry up and rebuild the temple. And who rebuilt the temple? It was Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah. So then we've got this gap. Then here's Esther, I believe, after the temple was rebuilt. The people reform under Ezra. Then there's a 12-year gap, and Nehemiah rebuilds the walls. And here's Nehemiah came back. Nehemiah went home. He thought everything was done. The walls are done. The city's all set. He went home. He was gone about 6 months, and the country was falling apart. So the king sent him back again. So that's why he came back. And then the book of Malachi shortly after Nehemiah, and then the 400 silent years. Now this is just one possible timeline. Some people actually say Nehemiah was before Ezra. And there is a decent argument for that, but I don't believe it. So, next slide. This is a timeline of the Second Temple, and that's one way of talking about the intertestamental period, because the Second Temple was rebuilt under Zerubbabel and Ezra. And so this is a timeline, and the Second Temple lasted until 70 AD when the Romans knocked it down. So this is another way, if you ever go online looking for information about the intertestamental period, you can look for the Second Temple period. That's another way of saying it. So the Babylonian captivity ends. The people rebuild the temple and the wall. Book of Malachi. So here's the end of the Old Testament. Who comes next? Macedonia, Alexander the Great. He defeats the Persians. In just a few years, he takes over the whole known world. But he dies young. He's an arrogant brat. He dies at the age of 30. And his empire splits. And so the Greeks are fighting over the divided world for 200 years. It's called the War of the Successors. Some of the most interesting people, I think if I went back in time to see an interesting time in history, it'd probably be from Alexander through the Successor Wars. Basically, Ptolemy took over Egypt, and he would frequently control Judea. So there was a huge Egyptian influence after the Persians fell. They came under the Greeks. Alexander gave them peace and tax freedom. But Ptolemy the Egyptian stole Alexander the Great's body and hid it in Egypt. So no one could ever claim to be the king of the empire because you have to have the king's body to take over. And you have to take it to Greece. So all he did is hide it in the desert. That meant 200 years of civil war. Now, Syria and Egypt traded. Egypt owned Israel for about 50 to 80 years. And then Syria got stronger and knocked off Egypt and took over Israel. So they went back and forth. The Egyptians owned it, Syria owned it. It was a tough time for Jerusalem. They were getting attacked every year or two by somebody new trying to break into Egypt to find the body of Alexander. But what happened is, then I told you in the Daniel sermons a few months ago about Antiochus Epiphanes, about 175 to 178 BC. He was a captive of the Romans. His father was defeated by the Romans in battle. When the Greek independence wars tried to go west, the Romans got scared and they built a huge army and they knocked the Greeks back and they took Antiochus' son captive. And they held him for 20 years. And they didn't torture him. They treated him like they spoiled him. They wanted him to see how generous Rome would be to its allies. So that hopefully when his dad dies, they send him home and he'll be friendly to Rome and want to continue to be friends with Rome. Well, when his dad dies, trying to pay recompense to the Romans for attacking them, the Romans always did this. The Romans would attack somebody and then charge them fees for dozens of years for not continuing to attack them. So it was bribe money. If you pay us, we won't attack you. He died raiding a temple trying to steal gold to pay the Romans. When he died, they sent his son home. And rather than thinking the Romans were great and generous, he declared himself a god and said he was going to take over the world. And he went down to Egypt to take over Egypt. And just as he was about to win, a Roman soldier got off his boat, a Roman senator got off his boat, walked straight up to the king through the bodyguards, drew a circle around Antiochus' feet, and said, if you step out of this circle before you vow to leave Egypt alone and give it to Rome, the Roman legions will attack you from the rear and destroy your country. So he didn't have much choice. He knew they could do it. He agreed, and he left Egypt. But he was furious. He had been embarrassed in front of his army. But the people in Jerusalem heard a rumor. The army of the Antiochus is coming home. They must have been defeated. And the rumor was that the king was dead. So they revolted against the garrisons in the city and killed all the Syrians in the city. Wrong idea. Because when the king got back, he then laid siege to the city and killed tens of thousands of people. Blood was running off the mountaintops. They were throwing babies off the walls. He was sacrificing pigs to a statue of himself that he called Zeus in the temple. So that was the first Antichrist. That's the one that Daniel refers to as the Antichrist. But after a while he gets tired of all the carnage and runs home to save his throne from his brother who rebels. And when he leaves, the revolt begins under the Maccabees. Now Maccabees means hammer. And it might refer to how good they were against the enemy. At first, all they were little terrorist groups hiding in caves. And they would come out and attack small groups of Syrians. But eventually, they got enough people to build an army. And Maccabees, Mattathias was the father. He died within a year. But he had 5 boys, and they were all warriors. And these warriors, one at a time, destroyed all of the Greek armies. And took Jerusalem back after 3 years. That's where the Hanukkah celebration comes in. Hanukkah. When they finally threw all the evil guys out of the temple, they cleansed it, and they had to light the candelabra, which was the old temple lantern. They only had enough oil for 1 day, but they lit it anyway, and according to legend, the candle lasted 7 days because they needed time to get more olive oil. So that's Hanukkah. And they were free then for over 100 years. First, the sons of the Maccabees ruled, and they did pretty well. They were, I would say, Pharisees, if not in name, in practice. They believed in strict Judaism, follow every rule. Anyone who does not follow the rules must die. And so they were zealous to keep the law. And there were no liberals allowed in his government. And if it was discovered you were a liberal, you'd probably die or get exiled at the least. So the Jews were pure for 100 years or so. They were free to do whatever they wanted. But as each boy died, either assassinated or died of old age. Eventually, their sons took over, and their sons and daughters were not necessarily faithful. And what would happen is that each king who came after the Maccabees, after about 50 years of their rule, each king or queen would trade sides. In other words, some of them liked the Pharisees, and the Pharisees were on their side, and they built the Sanhedrin at this time. But occasionally one would rise who liked the Sadducees, who liked liberal. And by liberal, I mean they liked Hellenization. They liked to speak Greek. Pharisees would not like to speak Greek because it was a pagan tongue. It was almost defiling just to speak Greek. So when the Pharisees kings ruled, Pharisees were in charge. When the liberal kings ruled, Sadducees were in charge. What eventually happened is that most of the rulers, being rich and powerful and wanting to have friendly neighbors, were Sadducee friends because they spoke Greek, they liked to have Olympic games, they liked to have dances and orgies and drink lots of wine. So if you didn't want to keep the rules, you went with the Sadducees. Okay? And that led, finally, the two sides were so opposed. The Pharisees and Sadducees were in equal power at one point. When they were in equal power, the Roman general, Pompey the Great, was up in Syria dealing with the Syrians for the last time. And after he defeated the Syrians, he was planning to go north into Russia and east into Persia. But the Pharisee king showed up and gave him 10,000 talents, which is like $10 million in gold, and said, I really could use your help we really respect Rome. If you would agree that I am the king in Judea, you have all this money. And Pompey said, sure, I'll think about it. And he took the money. And then 2 days later, the Sadducee guy who wanted to be king showed up and gave him 15,000 talents. And then the Pharisee sent back more. And then, so Pompey was getting rich, doing nothing but sitting in Lebanon with his army. And finally, when the gifts stopped coming, Pompey said they must have a boatload of gold in their temple. So he marched his army south. He had no intention of going to Judea. It was a podunk desert hole in the wall. He got there and he raided the temple thinking they were hiding all this gold. There was nothing. So he was furious. He defiled the temple not by sacrificing pigs. He just went in looking for food or gold, and when he didn't find it, he left. But he left people in charge who were not Jews. He deposed both kings and left Herod the Great's family in charge. It wasn't Herod the Great, but it was his father Antipater. So they were half relatives of the Maccabean kings. So they were half Jews, half Arameans. So the Jews hated them being half-breeds, but they had lots of money, enough to pay Pompey's bribes. Pompey put in charge, and Rome would, from there on, put in charge whoever gave him the most money. It was just a mafia scam is what it was. That's how Herod the Great got to be in power. And then Herod, in order to grow in popularity, tried not really rebuilding the temple. It wasn't destroyed, making it fancier. The temple built by Zerubbabel and Ezra was pretty much just a fancy house. Not very fancy, not like Solomon. So Herod, in order to try to gain reputation, added gold and started adding lots of decorations. And so in the time of Jesus, it always says the temple is not finished yet. It just means they're still renovating. And they actually finished the renovations in 67 AD, 3 years before the Romans knocked it down. So Herod's temple didn't go too well. Okay, next slide. All right, so I gave you a quick summary. Here's during the Greek period. The Persians owned all of this, and Alexander the Great came in from Macedonia and beat them here and here and here, took over Egypt, and then he marched and defeated them here and here, killed the king here, and then marched in. He wanted to go all the way to China, but the war elephants stopped him in India. He almost lost the battle. His army mutinied and refused to go further because of the elephants. So he cut back across the desert to get home quicker, to raise a new army that wouldn't mutiny on him. He had been marching for 10 years. His army was tired. So he's going to build a new army. But going across the desert, half of his old army dies of thirst and starvation, and he probably gets malaria and dies in Babylon the next week after he arrives. And that's when the revolt, or the four kingdoms, split. So here you see the Ptolemies owned Egypt, the Seleucids owned Syria and eventually Jerusalem. And then there were a couple of smaller kings, one in Macedonia and one in Turkey. So that was the broken empire. Next slide. Okay, these are the Maccabean years. I told you right about here is when Antiochus Epiphanes started his Antichrist activities. These are the sons of Maccabee. Judas was the first and perhaps the best king, and then Jonathan for 20 years, and then Simon for 10 years, and then their son for 20 years. But then their kids started getting worse. And one would be a Pharisee and one would be a Sadducee. One's a Pharisee, one's a Sadducee. So they were always civil war. It was always which brother could get the most money, most support from the people. And finally, that all came to an end about here when Pompey stepped in and took over for Rome. This just shows their kids, and see, here's Herod the Great, right here. So he was his mother was a foreigner. That's why he was half foreigner. Next slide. Okay, what happened in Judea when the Greek Empire collapsed? The Antichrist defiled the temple. I told you about that. The sons of Mattathias led the guerrilla war. They gained their freedom in 166 BC. Then the rulers alternated between Pharisees and Sadducees, conservatives and liberals. This equality of power led to constant civil war until that Rome took over in 63 BC under Pompey. And it was the sly family of Herod who was in power because they had the most money. They kept bribing Romans to stay in power. As long as the money was going to Rome, the Herods stayed in power. This lasted almost 100 years. But finally, when Herod the Great died, he had killed most of his sons and wives. The only ones left were pansies and couldn't raise money enough to keep Rome happy. And so they were basically deposed and procurators took over. They still had some title, kind of like the Queen of England has title, but not a lot of power probably. Symbolic power is all she has. That's basically what the Herods had. And as soon as Herod's sons died, Rome just forgot all about the kings and just had direct control. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk about the Pharisees. They were based on the scribes or teachers of the synagogues formed during the Babylonian captivity. Now, they never called themselves that for a long time, but during the time of the Maccabees, they started calling themselves Pharisees. I think it means pure ones. We're the pure guys. We do everything right. They became powerful when Judas Maccabeus ruled Judea. They were his spiritual advisors. So he kept these guys around him as like a cabinet. And thus the conservatives stayed in power. They emphasized purity at all times for all Jews. And they're the ones who said you should avoid Gentiles because they'll make you impure. And this is something that the Pharisees and Jesus fought about when Jesus was around. Jesus was gathering with tax gatherers and sinners. Pharisees would never do that. They're impure. Now, why did they think they were impure? Because they thought the law was too easy. Moses' law was just too simple. In order to keep from breaking Moses' law, they added new laws, part of the Talmud, which were traditions. How do you avoid breaking the Sabbath? You can bury your toothbrush 50 yards from where you want to go the day before. It's not work to walk to get your toothbrush. Thus, you're already close to where you wanted to go, so you can go the next 50 yards. So you just hide items along your path that justifies your breaking the Sabbath, in their opinion. Weird stuff. That's the weird stuff. It was the Talmud and the Mishnah. So they believed in the Old Testament plus all the traditions. Kind of like the Roman Catholics now have more traditions that aren't necessarily in the Bible. They were sometimes liked by the rulers, but sometimes they were hated by the rulers, like the Sadducees. So they traded power. The Pharisees ruled in the countryside synagogues. In other words, just like today in a sense, the Republicans mostly are in the rural areas and the Democrats are mostly in the cities. That's exactly what they had in Judea, but there was only one city, Jerusalem. So the Sadducees ruled Jerusalem, Pharisees owned everything else. The Sadducees, in a sense, had more power because politically the rulers liked them because they allowed them to have their parties and drink their wine and marry anyone they wanted and have Olympic Games, etc. So rulers liked Sadducees because they didn't have to follow any rules. That's why they no longer like the Pharisees. However, as far as power goes outside Jerusalem, the Pharisees rule the country. And finally, they downplayed the need for a Messiah except as a conquering hero. You see, they were already pure. They don't need a Messiah to save them from their sins because they ain't got no sins. So all they thought a Messiah, God would have to send a Messiah to wipe out the Romans. That's all they were looking for in a Messiah. So passages like Isaiah 53, they would not read very often because they don't want to talk about a suffering servant who is the Son of God. So when Jesus read that out of the law, they weren't too happy. And then he commented on it that he was the one. Then they were really unhappy. Next slide. Okay, so now the Sadducees. These were in general rich people and rulers in Jerusalem, and they were very political. Pharisees would say, we're too pure to be involved in politics. Well, that's just because they were already kicked out of politics. I'm sure if they were in it, they'd love it. And in fact, some of the Pharisees were in the Sanhedrin. We'll talk about that. They got political. The Sadducees wanted to be international. They wanted one big happy world, in this case under the Romans, because that allowed them to make money through trade. Pharisees didn't believe in trade because you're dealing with Gentiles. Olympic Games, new ideas, and lots of money. So the Sadducees are rich liberals. They wanted to cooperate with foreign rulers so they could keep their money and power. So you don't want Pharisees in charge because they'll take away all your money or won't let you have it or criticize you. But the Sadducees, in order to be this way, they only looked at the Bible as a cultural unifier. In other words, the Sadducees didn't believe in any part of the Bible except the first 5 books. And those commandments were suggestions, not commandments. And the reason is, they believed that God just wanted the people to have an identity. And so he gave them identity by making them separate. But the Sadducees say the only thing you really need to be separate is you have to make your sacrifices. Now, why would they say that? The only laws they believed in were the sacrificial. They liked Leviticus. That was their book. Leviticus was their book because they're all priests. So the priests need money. You get money by getting people to come to Jerusalem and make sacrifices and give tithes. So all you do is emphasize you've got to tithe and you've got to make your sacrifices. Anything else is okay. God will forgive you for the rest. See? So they didn't believe in angels. They didn't believe in heaven. There was no afterlife. All they believed in was priestly duties to keep the Israelites happy. It's just a morale boost, and it's how we line our pockets. So they made Jerusalem their power center and the temple. And thus, when the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, the Sadducees were vanished. Once Judea no longer exists, and there's no Jerusalem and no temple, they got no money, they got no identity, they got no jobs. So that was the end of the Sadducees. Next slide. Now the Essenes, these guys do not show up in the Bible, at least not obviously. They're famous, and the reason I bring them up is because it's believed that the Essenes wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. These were scrolls found in 1946 in jars in caves. And the story is that a shepherd boy was taking care of his flocks in this canyon, and he saw caves up above him that he couldn't get to, and he was bored and he was throwing rocks. And he would occasionally hear a crash, and then he realizes there was something in there. This is in 1946. So he tells his father, and his father comes back and his brothers, and they climb up to the caves and they find all these jars full of papyrus. And wanting to make money, they take them to town and start selling them on the street for nothing. And some Bible scholar finds these ancient scrolls and buys some and convinces his Bible Society to buy some more and pay the guy a fortune to take him there. And then they excavated it and found all the Dead Sea Scrolls. And they found pretty much the entire Old Testament, plus 2 or 3 bits of apocryphal books, plus lots of other ancient literature that was not in the Bible. So it was a great find. Estimated to be from before the time of Christ, from 200 BC to 50 BC, or maybe up to the time of Jesus. So these are by far the oldest texts, and we call this the Masoretic text. A lot of your Bibles will have footnotes. M in the column, that's for Masoretic text. The LXX, if you see LXX, that's the Septuagint. 70, LXX is 70 in Roman numerals. Anyway. Far older. Our newest Septuagint comes from the 8th century, 800 years after Jesus. All of our old Bibles before 1946 were based on manuscripts from the Septuagint and old Jewish documents from the same period. These go back before Christ. So all of those guys who said the Bible was written by Constantine in 350 AD are idiots, because we've already found the Bible written 100 BC. So don't listen to those guys. The Essenes, they were desert-dwelling mystic intellectuals seeking quiet and piety and purity. They thought the Pharisees were impure. The reason the Pharisees were impure is because they could see women. This is basically a monastery. A bunch of guys, intellectual guys, they would work together as a community, share all their farmed food in the desert, and write scrolls. That's all they did. That's how they stayed pure. They did believe in a future Messiah. They called him the teacher of righteousness. And so some people believe that the disciples might have joined. They thought John the Baptist was an Essene. Some scholars say John the Baptist lived out in the desert wearing cheap clothes, camel hair, And so they thought John the Baptist might be an Essene. And so they think when John the Baptist told the disciples to go follow Jesus, the disciples thought, oh yeah, he's one of those pure Essene guys from out in the desert. Probably not, but anyway, they also had a heavy emphasis on apocalyptic literature. They were always talking about the end of the world and disasters, kind of like your dispensationalists today. That's their fascination, is with the end. That's the way these guys lived. One reason they lived in the desert is they were sure the end of the world was coming, and God was going to destroy the rest of the earth, and only the guys living in the desert would survive. So, okay, next slide. The Sanhedrin. I learned some interesting things about these guys this last week. There were actually multiple Sanhedrins. There were lesser Sanhedrins in every major city. So if you had a city with, say, more than 10,000 people, they had a Sanhedrin there. And in every one of them, they had 23 rabbis who acted as judges. So this is where the Pharisee power works, everywhere except Jerusalem, because they run all of the countryside. So the Pharisees basically run everything but Jerusalem. The great Sanhedrin is in Jerusalem. They have 71 rabbis who act as judges. Probably 2/3 of them were Sadducees, probably 1/4 of them were Pharisees, and then there were a few extra guys who were just rich enough to pay the king to let them be on it. They ruled the Sanhedrin. The great Sanhedrin met every day in the temple, except on Sabbath and festival days. That's one of the reasons Pilate was so weirded out when the Sanhedrin showed up on a Sabbath day or at a festival day. Like, what are you guys doing here? Well, we got this crisis with this crazy preacher. We need you to kill him for us. So, they met in a place called the Hall of Hewn Stones, which was in the temple partly. In other words, you weren't supposed to have any secular buildings in the temple. So what they did to avoid this rule, they built it inside the temple halfway and outside the temple halfway. So you could enter from the temple or come out into the temple, but they met on the side outside the temple. So it's one building. It's like those guys in West Virginia and Kentucky. They're dry county on one side and alcohol on the other side. So you build a bar on the border. You can get in from the dry side, but you can go in and have your drink legally and come back. It's exactly the same thing the Sanhedrin did. So they met in the temple and outside the temple. All 71 only came together for emergencies. So even though they met every day, probably half of them would show up, just like the House of Representatives. If there's no important business, they don't show up. They only get together for emergencies like Jesus. All of them were there. The high priest is in charge. There were some Pharisees, some Sadducees, and some lawyers. So that's the Sanhedrin. Next slide. Synagogue worship. This is where the Pharisees were in charge and where Jesus spent a good deal of time. Why would Jesus spend a good deal of time in synagogues? Because it was the only place where the Word of God was. And even though the Pharisees were in charge, there were still holy people among them. Some of them, like Nicodemus, interested, awakened to the gospel. There were synagogues in every major town and city. Now, synagogues, where were they started? Babylon. Ezekiel. Daniel probably helped, but Ezekiel started the synagogue idea. Why? Because the temple is gone. God told them to make houses, build houses, and marry women and start farms. You're going to be gone a long time. How do you then worship God if you got no temple? Ezekiel and Daniel apparently came up with the idea of synagogues. They were basically home Bible studies at first. You would just meet in somebody's house. You would, if you had a Torah, you'd read from it. If you didn't have one, you'd cite from it. You'd discuss it. Okay, now later in Jesus' time at synagogues, they were built, every synagogue had a ritual bathtub in front of the door so that you could cleanse yourself before entering. You remember the Pharisees always bugging Jesus, why don't your disciples wash their hands before they eat? They weren't talking about the disciples having dirty hands. They weren't getting their holy water in front of the synagogue bath. So that's all they're talking about. Why aren't the disciples? So a lot of the people got into the habit of washing their hands in front of the synagogue or any other part of your body that's unclean. Jesus wasn't in for that. He didn't say you had to go to the ritual bath. Now in the synagogue, the important guys got to sit on benches. If you were rich enough or smart enough, you got to sit on the bench. Everybody else sat on the floor. That's the men and the boys. All the girls stayed in back. They were behind a barrier, not a wall that couldn't be seen through. The bottom part was a wall and the top part was a lattice. So they could see through and they could hear and smell, but they could not participate. They weren't in the same room. Just like the temple, in the temple, the men went in to sacrifice with their sons. The women and daughters stayed in the hall of women, as they called it, in back. They could watch through the doorway or see through the windows, but they couldn't go in. Keeping the women separate, that goes all the way back to the Torah. The man is supposed to do before the Torah, before Moses, men sacrificed on behalf of their whole families. When Moses came along, God said, now the men will sacrifice on behalf of their whole families with the priest doing it. So the man comes in, the priest sets it up, the man actually cuts the animal's throat. So he still participates, but then the priest takes the blood, throws it on the altar, gives some to the high priest on some days, and then they go. So the women were not allowed in the temple or tabernacle all the way. They were allowed part way. So the synagogues wanted to keep the same idea. They had a small menorah instead of a giant one like in the temple. They didn't need a big one. They had a small one. They had a Torah box. They kept their copy of the law in the box. And they had Moses' seat. That's an interesting quote you see sometimes in the New Testament. Moses' seat was the nickname for those who would read from the Torah. So, in other words, the rabbi didn't do all the work in the synagogue. The rabbi would ask for volunteers or point at someone and say, I'd like you to read from the Torah. And he would come up and he would sit on Moses' seat to read from the Torah. It was a high seat so that everyone could see and hear. So that's what they did in the synagogue. Now they had a 5-part service, or at least 5 parts in their service, not always in this order. Prayers, singing psalms, making blessings, that would be on like children and sick people, doing readings from the Bible, the Torah, and then making comments on the text. That would also be done from Moses' seat. So the rabbi would usually only call on people he trusted to make decent interpretations. But when he called on Jesus, and Jesus came up and read from a passage and said, I fulfilled this today, the rabbi would not have been happy because he would be a Pharisee who doesn't believe in a Messiah. And finally, they elected their elders for the synagogue. They elected him as the leader to do most of the teaching. So it would be sort of like a pastor now. And sometimes he would have guys fill in for him. But they would always have other people do Bible readings, and occasionally other people do the commentaries on the text. Now, how do you control the worship? If you're a Pharisee and you don't... what you do is you pick the passages you want them to read. So you can ignore the ones you don't want to read. Unless you've picked someone from the crowd to come read and he takes a different scroll. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is a map showing how the Romans broke up the divisions, broke up Judea. In other words, even though Herod the Great was in charge for quite a while, and his sons, the Romans told them what the names of their countries would be. And so this is how they broke it up. So in the Bible, when you read about Judea, we're talking about the area around Jerusalem. Idumea, where Herod was from, is to the south, on the way to Egypt. So he was half Idumean and half Judean, half foreigner. Here's Perea. This is where John the Baptist spent most of his time, east of the Jordan River, baptizing right here on this side. The Decapolis just means the 10 cities. Here's Galilee up here in the north. Oh, here's Samaria. When they tell you, when Jesus says, or the Pharisees say, you can't go through Samaria, the Pharisees and good Jews would cross to Perea, walk up along here, along the dirt trails by the river through Decapolis, and then go back to Galilee. They would not go through Samaria, because these were the half-breed wicked people who caused lots of trouble for them in the intertestamental period. And the Samaritans no longer believe, they taught that worship, true worship, was done here in these mountains, not in Jerusalem. And they get that from one verse in the Torah. I believe Moses once went to, or was it Joshua? It might have been Joshua. Worship, no, I think it was Moses. Anyway, at one time, God told Moses to go worship on a mountain up here. And the people went up there and worshiped. It must have been Joshua, because Moses wouldn't have gone in Samaria. But anyway, they all said, Jerusalem is a lie. All the priests are lying. We need to worship here. The real reason they said that? Money. You don't want your people going to Judea and spending their money in Jerusalem. So you build a temple here, and they come to our temple. So the Samaritan woman was saying, we worship here, you worship there. Who's right? And Jesus said, you're both wrong. God wants worshipers who worship in spirit and truth. which would be the future because Jerusalem is going to be destroyed soon. Also, Samaria is going to be destroyed soon. When the Romans came for the final Roman war, they didn't distinguish between Essenes, Pharisees, Sadducees. These were Jews. The Jews rebelled, the Jews die. The legion showed up and killed everybody. The ones who survived fled into the hills. So, anyway, this is how they broke it down. Here's Phoenicia, Tyre and Sidon up here. Jesus didn't meet a Phoenician woman, I believe. Well, Elijah did. I'm pretty sure Jesus met a Phoenician at some point. Anyway, and here's Syria. Next slide. Okay, so Jews under Roman rule in Christ's time. The Herods ruled for 60 years until the Romans took direct control. The Jerusalem and the temple were under huge renovations for decades by the Herods. This is how they tried to be popular. It didn't work. But it was also true that Herod the Great was a brilliant architect. He built the port at Caesarea. Judea had no natural ports. There was nowhere you could land ships. There were cliffs along there. There's no big beaches, and there's no harbors. So Herod the Great, probably his greatest engineering feat was not the Temple Mount, but Caesarea, where he built an artificial harbor so that Roman ships could come in and trade, and Greek ships. So he helped the economy a lot, but the people still hated him. The Jewish hated the Gentiles, which meant the Romans mostly stayed hidden in the city of Caesarea. In general, Jews would not go there because that's where the Romans and all the Gentiles lived. And why did they live there? Because if they went to Jerusalem, they could get killed by zealots. These zealots were radical Pharisees, probably paid by the Pharisees, who hated all foreigners and wanted a free country, and so they would hide in caves and such, and they would come out at night with their daggers and stab people. And they would stab Gentiles, Romans especially, Samaritans, and any Jew who was thought to deal a lot with them. So Jesus would have been in danger from the zealots just because he spent time with non-Jews. It's sort of like Pharisee hit squads. I don't know if you remember Ireland, the IRA. You know, you can't say that the Irish are all terrorists, but they have their terrorist group, and probably everybody supported them with money. That's the way the zealots were. Now, most people were poor. Why? Because in order to stay in power, the Herods had to soak people for taxes to pay the bribes. Was that better than having Roman charge directly? Maybe. Probably. At least he was sort of Jewish and believed in the temple. So you can make a case that Herod was possibly better than the governors afterward. And as soon as the Herods go out of power and the Romans take over directly, it's nothing but war for 30 or 40 more years. So the Herods, kind of like Saddam Hussein, you knock off this guy who's a tyrant and the country dissolves because it was his power, maybe not charisma, but his power and fear kept things working. Herod was a great tyrant. So anyway, all the people were poor because he had to get most of their money to pay bribes to stay in power. If he hadn't been there, the Romans would have taken it directly. So either way, the people are in trouble. The Sadducees soaked people. All their remaining income goes to the temple for their tithes and offerings. And in order to bleed a turnip, you make them pay extra. You use false weights and measures. Why did Jesus overthrow the money changers? Because they were cheating. Well, there were many reasons, but one reason is they were cheating. So if you were outside the temple and put your gold on the scale, it would be fairly honest. But if you went into the temple, you were required to buy temple coins, and you couldn't buy them anywhere except in the temple. And they had scales that were false, so you'd lose probably a fourth of your money to them cheating you by having light weights and saying, oh, you don't have a whole ounce here, you've only got half an ounce. Anyway, the zealots and the rebels were rising, paid by the Pharisees to resist the Romans. Every time a new resistance would start, more Roman troops would come in. Oh, maybe my ear thing fell. And then the Herods were deposed. Next slide. Okay, so here's our summary. We might have one more slide, I can't remember. What were the major plans of God during the intertestamental period? The Jews established synagogue worship in Babylon. That would later become the model of the Christian church. Our little churches are based on the synagogue model. We do things pretty much the same way they did. So that's the big thing that came out of Babylon. The Jews learned to worship in small groups. The Persian model of Judean rule with the high priest and a secular governor became the model of a church-state relationship. In other words, you're supposed to have a king and you're supposed to have a high priest. And they each have separate spheres of power. The high priest does the spiritual stuff, the king does everything else. This is something that we sort of practice in our country. The state does not rule the church, and the church does not rule the state. So, Persians, we got that from Persia. Greeks, what did we get from the Greeks? We got language. Greek became the language of the world. Everyone on earth spoke Greek, even in the Roman Empire. Greek was the language of business. Just like in the in the world now, if you want to be a trader and trade stocks and commodities, you have to know English. English is the language, not because of America, it is now, but because of the Brits. The Brits' colonial empire spread over the world. Everyone learned English if they wanted to make money. We've now sort of taken over the world's economy in a way, but English is the language. In that time it was Greek, so even the Romans spoke it. So anywhere the apostles and disciples went, they could witness to people because everyone spoke Greek. The Romans created safe roads and shipping lanes for spreading the gospel. By taking over the world, the Romans, who were control freaks, and they would destroy anyone who might someday be a threat. Thus, the world was safe. You were safely under tyrants, but you weren't going to get killed by bandits or raiding enemies. You were going to get fleeced for taxes. If you can live with that, everything else is fine. You got roads, you can roll your cart from Spain to Israel or Syria or India on Roman roads safely. They had patrols marching on the roads, just like we have highway patrolmen. They had garrisons every 20 miles, so if anybody really caused trouble, the garrison had come out with the legion. So Rome made the world safe. And its Roman government and justice system became the model for Western civilization in the United States. The United States tricameral system is basically the ancient Roman system. We have a House of Representatives. The Romans called it the House of Equites. We have a Senate. The Romans had a Senate. We have a separate judiciary. We have a separate judiciary. And we've got a president. They had a consul. Their consuls were elected usually for 2 years instead of 4. So we've got the same system the Romans had, at least for now, until crazies take over. Next slide, if there is another slide. That might be the end. Okay, that was the end. So God used Babylon to build synagogues and teach small group worship. God used Persia to help with the government system, separation of church and state, and also sort of friendly relations with other countries. The Greeks brought language and culture that everyone kept for hundreds of years, including the Romans. In fact, the Romans often took Greek myths and changed, like Mars. Mars is the Roman god of war. He was just the Greek god, Ares, the god of war. They just renamed them because they liked all the Greek stuff. In fact, the Romans had this thing about Greek art. They would send armies to Greece to loot all the art, bring it back and sell it in Rome because everyone wanted Greek art. And then the Romans brought safety, then peace, and roads and shipping, and that would last for hundreds of years. So that allowed the early church to spread because we all had the same language, we had safe roads and ships to travel on. Okay, any questions about the intertestamental period?
No question, but just very interesting coming from that perspective. How it changed. We're just like it today.
In what way?
I mean, in all the way from government,
Liberals and conservatives and
conservatives, and their rules and their politics.
right, and that's what worries me about our current political system is that we have so close an equality between Democrat and Republican parties. That's what happened in Rome. When the Roman Republic fell, the House and the Senate could never pass anything because they both hated each other and disagreed on everything. And dictators, including Julius Caesar, rose and took over, promising to break the gridlock. And that's what we could have someday, is someone running for president or a military leader says he'll break the gridlock and fix the government. And we'll all buy it because we're tired of gridlock. And we will accept a dictatorship, and the republic is over, and the empire begins. So that's a danger I would warn about. Other questions? Okay, well, I guess we'll take our break and have our prayer meeting back there. Oh, somebody should close us in prayer probably. Somebody up front. I guess, Mike, you're always up front.
Lord God, we're grateful for this lesson this morning. Lord, we look into history and see your hand and your providence worked out. I pray, Lord, that you prepare our hearts and minds for worship. Lord, I give great praise that you've given us this time to be in your presence. Lord, that we might fellowship with one another. Lord, that we might worship you and praise you.
Amen.